Good afternoon, and welcome to the Authors Club LitFest Online. My name is Chris Schüler. I'm a writer and former chairman of the Authors Club, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce Leonie Charlton. Leonie's book Marram, which has just been published by Sandstone Press, is an account of a journey through the Hebrides with her friend Shuna and their horses, Ross and Chief, travelling north from Barra all the way to Lewis. At the same time, the journey also served as an attempt to come to terms with her relationship, her somewhat difficult relationship with her late mother, Catherine. Leonie, did you set out, when you set out on your journey, did you plan to write a book about it, or did that come later?
That's a great question. I've done quite a few long trips with the horses, and I always go with a notebook, and you always think, well, maybe something will come of it. But no is the answer. I didn't expect to write a book about that. I didn't expect, but once I got back, it demanded to be written. I was working on a novel at the time, and I put that aside for a couple of years because it just wouldn't leave me alone.
Yeah, for readers who may not know, could you explain the title?
Marram, yes. So Marram came to me as a title quite late on, and I'd been really struggling. And when it arrived, it was a huge sigh of relief. Marram is a type of grass that you get in the dunes on the west, in the Outer Hebrides, and is a very tough, resilient grass that keeps the sand from blowing away in gales. And it's very beautiful in itself, but it also, to my mind, acts as a very appropriate metaphor for my mother, who was incredibly tenacious and tough and courageous and beautiful and withstood a lot of storms. So yeah, that's Marram.
Yeah, now it's clear from the book that the logistics of the journey were quite a challenge in themselves, in that you were only able to take the ponies across from one island to the next by ferry in a horse box. So you had to go back and retrieve the horse box each time you crossed from one island to another. That must have involved a considerable amount of planning.
There was a fair bit of planning, but actually having the box and the pickup there meant we could be a little bit more flexible because we had a base where we could keep stores. In the past, we've done long trips, and you have to be phenomenally organized about where you leave food, and because there's only so much you can carry. So in a way, it was liberating, and that came as a bit of a surprise.
Yeah. Could you say something about the particular significance of the Outer Hebrides for you and for your mother as well?
Well, for anyone who's been to that Outer Isles, have you been, Chris?
I haven't, I'm afraid.
Oh.
You're my to-do list.
Is it? Oh, good. I can't recommend it strongly enough. Yeah. Well, my dad was a vet in Oban. My parents were separated, so I lived with my mum from the age of 3. But Dad came up to Oban, which is where I am now in Argyll, and he was a vet in Argyll, and part of his job was to go to some of the islands. So we'd go to the Inner Hebrides with him, and I really got a taste for them. And then he took us on a holiday when my brother and I were 13 and 11, and it completely captured my heart. And the Outer Isles was also somewhere my mum loved to go, but we never went together. But she had several holidays, and work took her there. At one time in her life, she was a translator for a shellfish exporter. She was crazy, absolutely crazy, particularly about Harris, the Isle of Harris.
And you also mentioned in the book that at a later stage she actually was a jeweler. And perhaps you'd like to say something about the beads you took with you on the journey.
Yeah, the beads. So, Mum was a jeweler, a very talented jeweler. She was a qualified silversmith, but beads were her passion, absolute passion. And she travelled all over the world collecting beads. It was a lifelong passion. And so I grew up with Mum threading beads. That's totally what I associated with her, and it was a passion that never waned, even though she was trying to eke out a living from it. The passion stayed. And we went on this riding trip 7 years after Mum had died, and I'd realized I wasn't getting better. I was not in a good way mentally and emotionally, and I just couldn't cope with her death, and I couldn't cope how I felt about our relationship, which had been really hard. And I was talking to a good friend of mine, Gloria, and she's a great fan of Alejandro Jodorowsky, who's a Chilean surrealist film director, and he talks a lot about the significance of the act. So you can think and talk problems through, but there's something incredibly healing about sort of a ritual or an act. And it gave me an idea to take some of Mum's beads and leave them every day as a gift to her, and to have time. It was like spending time with her in a very personal way, based in gratitude, really. So that's what we did.
And you end your journey at the megaliths
Up at Callanish.
Yes.
Yeah.
Would you like to say something about that place? It's
yeah.
clearly special.
An extraordinary place, and again, that's a really strong link with Mum. She was obsessed with ancient history, particularly standing stones. And in fact, the place we spent many years as we were growing up was a place called Kenholy in Dumfries and Galloway, which the old farmhouse we lived in was right next to two stone circles. And many things that Mum had given me in terms of interest, I had rejected at one point or another, but the standing stones stayed. Like I inherited her love of standing stones. And up at Callanish, there are lots of sites, but there are 3 main sites, and a vast number of stones. And we finished the trip there, and I left the last beads for Mum at sunrise at Callanish. It was very special.
It's clear from your book that she was quite an extraordinary person, and a natural rebel. Would that be fair?
Absolutely, Chris. And I grew up somewhat in her shadow, as in I could never be as brave as Mum, or just she was a woman of superlatives, very beautiful, very brave, didn't appear to give a damn what anyone thought, and really naughty. And like, she would be the first person to admit how naughty, to her being naughty was very important, and she liked naughty people. So an amazing woman, and quite hard to be her daughter sometimes.
It's
as I write about, I think.
Yeah, you must have had quite a bohemian upbringing, really.
Yeah, and we lived all over the place. I had so many primary schools, I lost count. And she was driven to live differently. She wasn't going to be like her parents, and she wanted to give us a lot of freedom, and I admire her for that. And inherently there are risks in there, because I didn't grow up feeling particularly safe.
And yet you embark upon this trip, which actually turns out to be quite perilous at times.
Yes, that wasn't the idea. I mean, it was full of surprises. Yeah, certainly it wasn't, as as Roger Hutchison, the author, wrote in a review. He said, it's not a pleasant canter up the Long Isle. It wasn't all beautiful and easy. It got very dark. Very dark. Yeah.
Yes, I should say for anyone watching who's planning to read the book that there's a real cliffhanger near the end. Mm-hmm. It's very dramatic.
Yeah. So I'm just very glad we all came out of that in one piece, obviously. Mm-hmm. And you learn a huge amount through adverse experiences. I'd never gone to an edge like that in my life. Mm-hmm. And it helped, I think. It helped certainly my internal journey with Mum and myself in all sorts of surprising ways. Yeah.
Was there anything that you learned about the islands along the way?
Oh, that I love being out there even more than I realized. Mm-hmm. It's I don't want to romanticize them, and I hope I haven't done that in the book. And yet there's something incredibly intoxicating about being on the edge. You ride up that west coast, you've got the Atlantic, you've got a very different light. We went in May, so the smells and the birds, absolutely extraordinary. And I think there's something about being on the edge like that encourages you to get in touch with who you might really be under it all. That sounds a bit cliche, but that was my experience, and I have a deep longing to go back. It's always with me, that longing. Yeah.
There is certainly something about stepping right outside of your normal routine that gives you a fresh perspective on your life. And
absolutely, yeah.
And by the end of it, did you feel that you had come to terms with your mother and achieved some sort of resolution?
Yeah, yes. And I also, I just felt that time I spent with her every day with the beads, and there were long days of silence. Shuna and I travel very quietly together. So there's a lot of time to think. And there was something very loving about leaving these beads. So rather than the old stories I used to go into of the painful places, I developed a new dialogue with her. I do believe relationship continues after death, and I think the relationship we have now is a lot easier to live with. Yeah. Thanks to doing that.
How long did the journey take in all?
21 days.
Yeah.
So 3 weeks, which isn't long. And it was also very long, certainly long enough to really let go.
Yeah.
And be in a different place.
How did you feel when you got back?
It took a little bit of adjustment. I was very happy to get home and see everybody. And I really mourned that sense of time. Interestingly, the only other time I've experienced that is now with lockdown.
Yes.
That I know there is tremendous suffering going on, yet for me personally, it's been a a wonderful opportunity to feel time, to feel the mass of time that we so often don't. We rush through life and our diaries. And I mean, the thing on that trip was how full a day is and how little you do in that day. You eat and you walk, you eat and you walk. And that is more than enough. And it's been a bit like this in lockdown. The days, you know, a day goes so quickly and you think, gosh, what have I done? You've eaten and you've maybe written or just been more present. And when you think of how much we normally put into a day, I find it really sobering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're probably coming to the end of our allocated time slot. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I'd like to thank you, Chris, for inviting me on here.
Not at all. Pleasure.
And it's been lovely. And to my lovely publishers, our publisher, Sandstone Press, who've done a beautiful job. And
well, certainly the cover is absolutely gorgeous. It's a beautiful illustration. Yeah. I would heartily recommend Marram to anyone. It's a wonderful piece of travel writing, and beautifully evocative of the landscape and the culture, the way of life of the islands, which is so different from what those of us who live in cities are accustomed to. And yet it's also a deeply touching memoir about your relationship with your mother. And so I just heartily encourage everyone to read it. And thank you very much, Leonie.
Thank you, Chris.
I hope the book's an enormous success. Thanks.
Thank you very much.